So I think we started with the Malay community. The Malay community have not moved back to Anwar Ibrahim. He has tried everything. He's given them more benefits as Bumi. For example, he's changed some Islamic institutions to actually funnel more funding to the Malay community. He's tried to change Teraju, give them more money to buy more Malay stake in the economy, as you know. And he's also taken a very high profile in terms of Palestinian issue. He thinks these are all vote winners for the Malay community. In some ways, he's right. This will give him a lot of social media and media profile in the Malay community, but I suspect it will not work because PAS is very, very good at last minute convincing the people on this issue of Negara Islam. And I think the way to do it is actually to get the economy right. If the Malays have more money in the pocket, they can see a future for their children, especially economic future. I think they will give him a chance. And this is where I come back to what I said earlier, that nothing must put the Malays. If the DAP overexert themselves, then that will put the Malays. You can see, right, one of the interesting news that came out immediately the day after the election, right, was PAS saying that, the election results show very clearly that the DAP was controlling the government. It came as a lead story. I mean, that is crazy, right? This is a DAP party election. So how can it be? How can it be about the DAP controlling the government? And then another headline that came out yesterday, right, was a PAS MP came out and said that, oh, we are not in favor of the PM having 10 years in government. I mean, that is an issue of good governance, right? I mean, if you look, all the countries around us impose term limits. In Indonesia, is twice. In the Philippines, is 1 6-year term. And this guy said, oh, it's a bad idea. We should have 2 terms. The Prime Minister can stay as long as he wants. And not only that, he added on, he said, by the way, right, even the Prime Minister have a term limit, the most important thing is that the Prime Minister must be a Muslim. If you don't believe me, please pick up the Malay newspaper. It was one of the lead stories. So you can see, right, no matter what the DAP does, right, they will play on this narrative that the DAP is sort of the puppet master behind Anwar Ibrahim. So that's the reason why I say it's very, very difficult, very, very difficult for DAP to proceed.
Yeah, so you're talking about how we are now halfway through his prime ministership for Dr. Sri Anwar, right? And so how would you gauge his performance so far? I think more importantly, how does he end his tenure before we enter G16?
So I think with Anwar heading forward, we should not expect any political reforms at all because he's trying to recover the Malay ground. So the way to understand the calculation on the Malay ground is that basically what PAS Bersatu Perikatan did in the last election and the sixth state election was that they managed to break out of the 4 core Malay states. So now if you look at PAS, they're actually very powerful, the Malay areas in Perak, in half of Pahang. They're making a big headway into Selangor. So for Anwar to stop the rise of PAS, he has to make sure that he has to win at least 1 or 2 of the core Malay states. So in the case of the core Malay state, it is quite clear that Terengganu and Kelantan are untouchable. They're basically PAS country. So his best chance is to keep Perak and maybe overturn Kedah. He's got to make sure he's got to roll back Perikatan in terms of Pahang and Selangor, and make sure that he consolidate in the lower half of the Malay Peninsula, which is basically Johor, Malacca, all those areas. But it's a big ask of him because he cannot do this alone. He has to rely on UMNO, and UMNO still has a machinery. The question is, can UMNO step up and do the job? The problem with UMNO is that if you look at UMNO, you just look at the number of elected UMNO members since 2008, when they lost the 2/3 majority. The numbers have been falling consistently in every election, 2008, 2013, 2018, and 2022. So UMNO in some ways is a dying party. And the reason why the Malays have rejected UMNO totally is that they don't see any reforms in UMNO. And in fact, UMNO has doubled down on the anti-reform message. When I talk about the anti-reform message, what I'm talking about is things like, UMNO today is still fighting for the innocence of Najib Razak. I mean, where in the world can you have a party, you claim to have learned your lessons, and then lo and behold, one of the key resolutions you pass at your PAU is to, get the king to pardon. This sort of signal, even for the Malays themselves, I don't think they can accept the political rehabilitation of Najib and his family. But if you speak to UMNO people, right, a lot of them actually think this is very normal. And the reason why they can think that this is very normal is because for the first 60 years of independence, right, where UMNO was running things, UMNO basically did what they want. And the reason why they did what they want was because of Mahathir was a strong man, and also the way they control the media, they control the way that the Malays think. And that is the reason why Mahathir had a very famous saying, Melayu mudah lupa, which is that the Malays will forget. And I think that is true today as well. People don't understand that the social media in Malaysia now is, I would say, easily more than half of the social media in Malaysia now is actually not about sharing news. It's all about sharing propaganda. This is especially true in Malay media. If you go to Malay media, most of people in the non who don't keep a close eye on the Malay media, I can tell you, right, the top influencers in the Malay media, right, are actually people who does religious content on Islam and Malay culture. They're actually not people doing current affairs. You turn it around and look at the Chinese influencers, actually lifestyle. Almost zero on the religious content. I'm talking about the influencers. Of course, there are people producing stuff, but I'm talking about the influencers. Very few people do religious stuff or or Chinese culture. Even if they do Chinese culture, it's mostly to do with China and Malaysia rather than Malaysia on its own. So you can see that each of these communities are living in their own little bubbles in the social media. So Anwar will have a very hard time, and also he will have a hard time winning the Malay ground is because for whatever reason, PKR, Pakatan Harapan, UMNO are very, very poor in social media. If you look at the way social media works in the last election, right, and also the state election, right, Perikatan won hands down.
Okay, so I wanted to actually ask you, because of course for non-pass supporters, there's a concern that in the next G16, the pass will continue its momentum, as you say, it's already making inroads to slower, right? To perhaps even have the potential to form the next government, right? So that's the other flip side of if Anwar doesn't make it, right? What are your views in terms of that possibility?
So the only way PAS can form the next government is that they have to win and break through the middle part of Malaya and move further down, win places like Pahang, Melaka, Negeri Sembilan, and Johor. But an easier way of doing it is that they just have to increase, Perikatan just have to increase their seats to 80 to 90, and they can grab the rest from Sabah and Sarawak. So as you know, right, Sabah and Sarawak controls 25% of the seats in the parliament. So if they can convince Sabah and Sarawak, which has 57 seats, if they can convince even half of them to cross, then they will have the bare majority of 115. But of course, 115 is not stable. They need at least 125 to have a working majority to make sure they stay in power. So Sabah and Sarawak is really, really important in terms of the calculation. It's the same with Anwar. I think we have to remind your viewers that, Anwar would not have been able to make it in 2022 if Sabah and Sarawak did not switch at the last minute. Many of your viewers may not be aware that the initial proposal for the government that was put forward to Agong has Perikatan National together with Sabah and Sarawak. But it was only after there was a huge backlash from the Christian community in Sarawak that GPS decided that, we cannot move forward with PAS, we have to switch over to Anwar. And because of that, Anwar became the prime minister. So I think it's really important people understand the real history rather than simply accuse Sabah and Sarawak of being mercenary. Yes, Sabah and Sarawak people are very mercenary, but in some ways they are mercenary is because they were badly treated in the last 50 years. So that's the reason why the so-called demands or promises made in MA63 are so important to the political class in Sabah and Sarawak.
So you've done quite a good job of distilling I think the 5 or 6 things that Sabah Sarawak want. Can you go through those 5 or 6 things? And I think more importantly, does Anwar try and get those things done before G?
Right. So a lot of things that Sabah and Sarawak wants, they can't get it done before GE16 because some of them will require constitution amendment. The first one, I'm talking about the big items, not the small. The first big item is, of course, they want the control back of the continental shelves. This is part of the oil and gas thing because under the Petroleum Development Act in 1974, any oil and gas found anywhere in the country called Malaysia belongs to this special company, which is created by Act of Parliament. It is not a normal company. It was created by Act of Parliament, Petronas. Secondly, they won one-third of the seats in the Dewan Rakyat. Again, this requires a constitutional change, and that will not be forthcoming for the next election, maybe after that. The third thing they want is, of course, a devolution. They want to get back a lot of the powers, previous stuff that was run by Sabah government, Sarawak government. For example, at the time of independence, right, Sabah and Sarawak government had their own education department, their own health department, all that sort of thing. So they want complete control. Again, that one, the devil is in the details, and of course the funding issue. The fourth item is that they want cultural and religious autonomy. As you know, right, a lot of Sabah and Sarawakians are complaining about this toxic rise of political Islam in Malaya or Peninsula Malaysia, and they do not want this sort of political culture to be exported or imported into Sabah and Sarawak. And therefore, they said that we must have some form of cultural and religious autonomy. What is not widely known was that during the negotiation phase for the Malaysia agreement, right, there actually was an agreement that says that while Islam is the religion of the Federation, Islam will not be the state religion of Sabah and Sarawak. This is actually well documented. But of course, in the 1970s, Sabah changed the constitution, making Islam the state religion now. But that doesn't change history, that this was part of the historical agreement. For Sabah, there's another very special thing that they want, which is a 40% of the revenue raised in Sabah has to be returned to the state government of Sabah. This is actually in the current constitution. So this one is the easiest one to what they call it, to enforce, because it's already in the current constitution. The reason why the federal government has not paid the 40% is because they stopped paying the 40% in the 1970s, and they're arguing with the Sabah government about what is the formula. How do you calculate the 40%? Because we're talking about a lot of money, and the federal government does not have enough money to pay the 40% plus the areas going back to the 1970s. And the final thing I think the political class in Sabah Sarawak wants is that they want the components of the MA63 to be built into the Malaysian constitution. This is a legal concept which a lot of Malaysians are not well aware of, and it's called the basic structure doctrine, which means that in every constitution, there are certain parts of the constitution that is so core to the constitution itself, right, that no parliament, no governments, it doesn't matter, parliament cannot touch it. So, for example, right, in the Malaysian, if you want to ask me, right, what is the core part of the Malaysian constitution that cannot be touched? For example, things like the Raja, the Conference of Rulers, the Bahasa Malaysia as the religion, as the country's language, all those are part of what we call the basic structure. But Sabah and Sarawak want their own guarantees to be part of the basic structure of the federal constitution. This is a big wish list. So the most difficult one is, of course, when it comes to politics, it's always resource and money. The continental shelf is a big thing. Even though the Prime Minister and the Sarawak Premier have announced that they've come to a deal on a PDA or Petronas deal, that deal is just at a high level. The devil is always in the details, and the deal has not been affected because they can't agree on the details. The one-third thing I mentioned, that requires a constitution amendment. This one, I need to say something. It's quite unusual because several NGOs in Malaya side has been campaigning actively against this. They say that Sabah and Sarawak should not get the one-third because it goes against democracy. And secondly, even if we give them the one-third, we should give them one-third in the Dewan Negara. I have been leading a campaign among Sabahans and Sarawakians to say that this is all nonsense. Sabah and Sarawak should get the one-third. It's got nothing to do with, that Sabah and Sarawak should be getting another form. What they want is a reset to what was promised back in 1963. Now, one of the big arguments back by the NGOs is that they say that if this is such an important thing, show it to us in black and white in the agreement that says that Sabah and Sarawak will get one-third of the seats. It is actually not part of the Malaysian agreement. It's not written down in black and white. But, as somebody who has kept an eye on politics for a very long time, who studied politics, right, in politics there is such a thing as convention and norms. It is not necessarily has to be written down. The best example of that is the British political institution. some of your listeners may be shocked to find out that Britain does not have a written constitution. Okay, so if you talk about written constitution, right, in Britain there's none. A lot of the thing is based on tradition, conventions, and political norms. So in the 1960s, Sabah and Sarawak and Singapore were given one third of the seats, and there are notes from senior officials who made it very clear that Sabah and Sarawak and Singapore wanted the one seat guarantee so that Malaya cannot bully them in terms of constitution amendment. So in 1965, when Singapore left the federation, right, the 15 seats for Singapore was taken away and it was not redistributed to Sabah and Sarawak. So this is where the so-called historical grievances come from. So it is nothing to do with the fact that whether it's written down or not, and whether what is good for Sabah and Sarawak. And I think the NGOs in Malaysia are very angry with me because I made the argument that, who are you to come and tell the Sabahans and Sarawakians what they want and what they don't want? And I think they're very, very annoyed because I used to work. Is this a new form of colonizer attitude, right? Only a colonizer will come and tell you what is best for you.
Malaysia is really at a political crossroads because really at working level, we want so much change, we're not getting it, right? You look at the stock market, it's gone nowhere in the last 5 years. As you say, the fix is the economy, but what's happening in the economy? It's stuck because the political forces are all coming together. So, what happens next?
So I think the Malaysian economy, interestingly enough, I think we have, I would say, 80% recovered from the COVID damage to the economy. The economy is actually doing not badly. Growth has come back. Last year, the official growth of about 5%. I would say it's probably 5.5, a bit higher than that. I think the growth is coming back. The key to the economy is actually productivity, making the economy more efficient, getting rid of red tape. One of the problems we have in Malaysia is that the government really intervenes in the economy too much. The red tape in Malaysia is incredible because of the UMNO's one man rule for Malaysia for 60 years. They keep creating monopolies in practice, but using the regulatory powers. So, for example, they will say that only certain people can import certain stuff. So even though that on paper it looks like anybody can apply for the license to import, you and I both know only certain people will get it. So it is a monopoly or monopolies in practice. So Malaysia really is a country where there's too much red tape, and if you don't get rid of the red tape, you don't free up the economy. I don't see how the economy can be more efficient. Of course, the counter argument to that is that we cannot have a free economy in Malaysia because because of the new economic policy, the affirmative action, the government will always have to intervene. What they don't understand is that if you have a free, open, and efficient economy, right, the affirmative action part will actually fix itself. The problem is that we keep thinking that the only way to intervene on behalf of the Bermuda community is government intervention. But we know that studies, even done by Malays themselves, show that it has not worked in the last 60 years. So the question is, and I'm not the first person to ask this, if this has not worked in the last 60 years, what makes you think that, by playing around on the edges that it will work for the next 60 years? The answer obviously is not going to work. And remember, I said that the world is changing very quickly. So I think in some ways the government is caught in the trap on its own making. So people like Rafizi, they all understand, even the UMNO minister, they understand this. But for political reasons, they're just too afraid to come out openly and say it. So what I'm suggesting is that certain things you cannot touch, that's fine. But get rid a lot of the red tapes, which is possible. Secondly, for new economy, right, for the new stuff in the economy, right, do not impose, that sort of red tape plus the Bermuda thing into the new economy. Because if you do, right, we will just, go back to the old ways, and sooner or later, right, I can tell you who's going to get our lunch. The Vietnamese and the Indonesians will come and grab your lunch. The days of free lunch are just over because the new economy, you just cannot put up, basically you can't put up a war anymore. And I can tell you, right, you can see Trump is putting up a war between Mexico and Canada, right? And even then, he has to back down. People keep forgetting, he imposed the war, right? And then he keep giving this so-called 30 days discount. So even he knows it. I mean, about him being a lunatic, but even he knows that, putting out a war is not going to work. So my point is that I'm not anti-Malay. I'm not anti-anybody. All I'm saying is that if you have an efficient economy, if the economy becomes rich, a lot of the affirmative action thing will work out by itself. The problem is that nobody is willing to try the wheel. My answer to that is that if you have tried the same method in the last 60 years, right, don't you think it's time to try a different method? And there's no harm. If the new method doesn't deliver, say, in 10 or 15 years' time, you can go back to full government intervention. This is not a one-way street. It's not like religion. You cannot get out. This one, it can start you and you can try, right? And we are famous for trying out new things. People say that, oh, they're not willing to try it. I think that is actually not true. A lot of people believe in things that are not true, right? You look at the way the airline industry has gone in the last 40 years. Malaysia Airline was privatized three times, right? And then went back to government ownership, went back to chronic ownership. So they've tried a lot of things. They allow AirAsia to come in. They allow all sorts of crazy airline, including that crazy Muslim-only airline that went bankrupt after one and a half years. So it is not true that if we economic policy you can't change. The question is that is there political will to change? So the other big barrier that they are unwilling to change is because policy making in Malaysia is controlled by a very small group in government, and outside the government is basically controlled by the GLCs. So I don't need to say anymore. Like, you know exactly what I mean. So if you were to ask me what Anwar should concentrate on in the next 2.5 years, obviously he has to prepare for the general elections. I will tell him that three very important things he's got to make sure he gets done. One, he's got to make sure the government goes through an economy recovery phase, but more importantly, he's got to make sure that the money is channeled downwards to the bottom 50. It's really, really important that the people have money in their pocket. Because at the end of the day, you can say all you want, you can fly all the Palestinian flags you want. If people don't have money in their pocket, they're gonna turn to religion. That's number one. Secondly, he's got to make sure that the seat negotiations are done very, very early on, not like 2 or 3 months before the one. If I were him, right, I'll make sure the seat everything is done, in this coming year, so you can plan for the election in 2 years' time. The third thing, right, he has to make sure that he has to introduce a lot of new faces, and this advice is very true for UMNO. If UMNO still put in a lot of old faces, right, that will be a drag. So he has to make sure these three are done. And finally, he's got to make sure he's got to lock in the support of GPS and GRS in Sabah. Sabah is having a state election later this year. He's got to make sure he lock in the support by making sure that he at least does something about the list that I gave you just now, or at least make sure that it will be done next time if he gets re-elected. If he can do all these things, I will give him a chance of 70% coming back at the next government. If he leaves everything until the last minute, say in the last year of his government, he's going to be in big trouble, because all the things I mentioned, right, requires at least 24 months to get it on the road. If he doesn't do all the things I mentioned, right, then it is true that people will say that Anwar will be a one-term wonder. And I think whether you like it or not, if you look across the political spectrum now, Anwar is the best, the best candidate for the whole of Malaysia, for both the Malays and the non-Malays. People can say he's the best of the worst, it doesn't matter, but that is the reality we live in. Until I see someone better, I would say that, for both the Malays, the non-Malays, and East Malaysia, he's probably the best candidate thus far.
Okay, man. Thank you. I hope you can hear this, but thank you for this, James. And I think we'll be talking about this for much, much more times in the future. Thank you once again, James. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.